This is BBC News with the latest headlines. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer a series of significant losses in London, but across the country, Labour are only making modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
And believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
Elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are making gains. In Hull, the Liberal Democrats won control of the council from Labour. Counting is getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. And in other news, the UN says a new convoy is heading to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in an attempt to rescue scores of civilians trapped underground with little food or water. Good morning and welcome to BBC News, with continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of three symbolic London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has only just begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. Let's take a look. You can see here 75 of 146 English councils declared. Labour have added 34 to their tally, bringing the total to 1,200 councillors. The Conservatives have lost 122 council seats, so they are on 540. A good night and morning so far for the Liberal Democrats. They're on 259, having added 59 councillors. Residents groups there, 40. They've added 6. And the Greens, an impressive 23 for them, bringing their total of councillors to 39. If we have a look at the number of councils, you can see that Labour have added 3. We've mentioned those 3 London councils, very symbolic, taken them from the Conservatives, puts them on 37. The Conservatives are down 6 on 18. The Liberal Democrats are on 4. They've added 1. They've taken Hull from Labour. Residents and Green on 0. Hung councils, no overall control, have added another 2, taking that total to 16. Our political correspondent Helen Catt has the story so far.
A symbolic win for Labour. Wandsworth in South London, Tory for 44 years until now. Even in an election about local services, having the lowest council tax in the country didn't keep it blue.
The cost of living crisis did come up, as did the massive cuts from the government since 2010, and also Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a vote winner for Labour, as indeed was Keir Starmer as well. And I'll remind you, Hugh, in 1998, a year after our landslide victory, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth. In 2002, a year after our landslide victory in 2001, we didn't win this seat in Wandsworth, and we've done it in 2022.
Wandsworth's former leader blamed the loss on the cost of living and said what he called the issue of Boris Johnson was raised. That was echoed by some Tory councillors elsewhere.
It's Partygate, it's not just Partygate. There's the integrity issue. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth.
In a surprising upset, the Conservatives lost Westminster Council to Labour, as well as Southampton and Barnet in North London, where the Labour leader went to mark the result.
This is a massive turning point for the Labour Party. From the depths of 2019, we're back on track now for the general election, showing what the change that we've done, the hard change we've done in the last 2 years, what a difference it has made.
Others maintain things aren't as bad as they could be for the Tories.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains. And I think if you take the whole picture of this, it really doesn't demonstrate that Labour has the momentum to form the next government.
Labour won the newly created Cumberland Council in the northwest, but it's not expecting big gains, and it's had losses too. The Liberal Democrats, who've had a strong night, took whole council from it.
And what was really interesting about last night's results, in places like Wimbledon and Cheadle and elsewhere, we were winning seats where we need to win seats in the next general election. So it was a great night for those councillors.
The Greens too have made gains. Also overnight, in Bristol, voters chose to scrap their mayor in a referendum. This is all only a partial picture. Almost half of England's councils have yet to start counting and will do so later today. So too will all of the councils in Wales and Scotland. And counting will start for all 90 seats in the Northern Ireland Assembly, with polls suggesting that Sinn Féin could become the largest party for the first time. Helen Catt, BBC News.
Let's chat to Chris Curtis, from Head of Political Polling at Opinion Research. Welcome to you, Chris. You're going to be with us for an hour. Let's just get a snapshot from you now. What's your general takeaway of what you've seen?
I think it's a disappointing night for the Conservatives, particularly in London, but not a great night really across the rest of England as well. But I still think it's fair to say that Labour is struggling to make the kind of gains that they'd need to make if they were heading for a majority at the next general election. So Tories down, Labour still not convinced the public that they're ready for government, and that's pretty much in line with what we've been seeing in the opinion polls in recent weeks as well.
Oh, right, so it has sort of followed the polling figures that we've had over the past few weeks?
Oh, yeah, almost certainly. I mean, as far as expectations goes, this is pretty much dead on where I expected. Maybe slightly better for Labour in London, but apart from that, everything's fallen out how the opinion polls would have suggested.
We'll come back to you in just a moment, but let's get some more detailed analysis of the results so far. We can cross the newsroom to Lewis Goodall at the touchscreen. Lewis, give us your sort of first analysis, if you like, of the figures so far. I know it's a mixed picture, but is there anything in terms of trends that you're seeing?
Well, Jo, let's take it one region at a time, shall we? First of all, let's get London out of the way. And we shouldn't underestimate London. Sometimes there's a tendency to say, oh, well, it's just London. What about the rest of the country? Well, remember, London has 70 parliamentary seats. It has more parliamentary seats than Scotland. It's a huge part of our electoral geography. And increasingly, the Conservatives are an endangered species. Remember, they only had seven councils going into this election. They're probably going to come out with 2 or 3. One of them that they've lost is Wandsworth. This, as we know, had been a Conservative council since 1978, the so-called flagship Margaret Thatcher jewel in the crown. You've heard all of the clichés already many times this morning, I'm sure, and Labour have taken it, and have taken it handily. 8 seats gained, Conservatives lost 8. They're going to be in control there. Of course, in terms of parliamentary politics, probably doesn't matter that much because all 3 seats in the Wandsworth borough are already Labour held. Indeed, Putney was their only net gain at the last general election, you might remember. Let's look elsewhere in London. In some ways, I think Westminster is the more surprising borough that Labour have managed to take. We expected Wandsworth to happen. Not many Labour people thought Westminster would happen. This has been Conservative even longer than Wandsworth, since its creation, since Harold Wilson was Prime Minister in 1964. And again, this, the home of Buckingham Palace and Marble Arch and all of these splendid, salubrious places of central London, not exactly known in the past for hosting Labour MPs or anything to do with Labour at all. The Ritz Hotel, and amongst other things. 13 seats gained for the Labour Party, 13 losses for the Conservatives. A spectacular win by all accounts. Instead of being these redouts of Thatcherism as they were in the 80s, they're now a symbol of Labour dominance in the capital. But Labour didn't just have victories so far in the capital. We saw Southampton, somewhere that frankly didn't need too much of a gain for Labour to take. They only lost it, as you can see here, in 2021, but nonetheless a reasonably modest performance. But 4 up 4, Conservatives down 4, enough to take the borough. And indeed, there has been a tendency a little bit to talk about London good for Labour, North bad for Labour. Maybe there's a bit of truth in that, but it doesn't hold everywhere. That's what's a bit perplexing about these results, because then you go to somewhere like Cumberland. This is a new unitary authority in Cumbria, in the northwest of England. So all of these seats were sort of notional, really. But nonetheless, you can see Labour have won this new council. 12 seats gained. Conservatives lost 14. And remember that what's really important about this, and what Labour will really take heart from it, and the Conservatives will be slightly worried about, is that this has a part of the country which has crucial swing seats, many of which the Conservatives only won in 2019 or 2017. 2017, Copeland, you might remember, the canary in the Corbynite coal mine, you might call it. In 2017 by-election, it was won by the Conservatives' Theresa May. It was one of those first bricks of the blue wall to fall. You've got Workington Man, you might remember from the 2019 general election. Well, Workington Man, according to this, basically voted for Labour last night. So the Conservatives will be worried about that. But then, just when you think you've got a trend going, you look at somewhere like Amber Valley or Nuneaton. These are places that until relatively recently were Labour controlled. So you go back to 2019, Labour were controlling this council. But instead of Labour making gains, they are slipping further and further and further away from the Labour column. And as you can see, these sort of places, 60% leave voting. All of the London ones that have been gained very heavily remain voting. You'll remember, Jo, in 2015, the Nuneaton seat, Ed Miliband knew that he was never going to be Prime Minister when that came in. Again, slipping away from Labour. Until 2018, it was Labour controlled, but just little by little, it's slipping further from their grasp. So what you can sort of say about this is that Labour are doing OK, the Conservatives are doing not that well, but then again, they have been in government for 12 years. You might expect that. And it all really depends on what you're comparing it with. Because if you're comparing Labour's performance with 2019 or 2021, the local elections, then they are doing quite a bit better, particularly in London, maybe a little bit worse outside of London, but they're doing all right. If you're comparing it, though, and essentially they're doing as well as they did in 2018. But of course, we know that 2018 isn't good enough for the Labour Party probably to become the biggest party, or indeed, let alone, form a majority government. So they'll take some heart from these results, and the Conservatives, conversely, will take some heart from these results as well. There is something and nothing in these results for everybody, which probably isn't very satisfying for anybody, but of course we've got many more to come throughout the day. So maybe more trends will present themselves as they do.
Lewis Goodall there. Thank you very much. Or that will definitely be back to you for more trends. But yes, I can see it's difficult to actually tell winners and losers overall on the figures we have so far. I introduced Chris Curtis, the head of political polling at Opinion Research earlier. We're also joined by the BBC London's political correspondent, Susan Mendonça. Let's start with London. Labour will obviously be celebrating those very important symbolic wins, although it's a capital city that was already trending towards Labour. But they are important, aren't they, to Keir Starmer, who's been in Barnet, one of those gains already this morning.
And we look at Barnet, for example, the last time round, Labour didn't manage to take Barnet, and they were being it was tipped that they were going to take Barnet. They didn't manage to, and it was largely seen as being down to the issues of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. It's a very Jewish area. There are a lot of people from Jewish community there, and it didn't go down well. And so the fact that Labour have managed to take Barnet now, I suppose for a lot of people within the Labour Party, they will see that as an example of the Jewish community certainly coming round to Labour after a period of time where they have not.
Well, and while you're talking, we can show our viewers actually the seats and the majority for Labour in Barnet. There you can see Labour on 41, Conservatives on 22. Very much a straightforward Labour-Conservative fight. You're absolutely right. The Conservative MP, of course, Theresa Villiers, is still there, but it will be interesting. She will be worried, no doubt, about her seat at the next general election.
Exactly. And last time round, her seat, it was very close. And so, you know, she's holding on by a whisker, and looking at what's happening in terms of the result today with Barnet, she will be looking at whether or not she manages to keep hold of her seat next time round. I think Wandsworth, where I was earlier on today, what I found quite interesting was that even though it looked as though Wandsworth was going to Labour, the Labour people there that I was speaking to were being very cautious about calling it. You know, they didn't want to call it.
Well,
because
expectation management, of course,
exactly, because last time round they actually got the popular vote there, but they didn't manage to get the votes where they needed them, so they didn't manage to get enough of the wards. This time round there have been boundary changes which have changed things up a bit, and they did manage to win it, and as you can imagine, they were jubilant when they did.
Right. What about reaction? Just before I come to Chris, what about reaction from Conservatives who've lost there?
Yeah, so we spoke to Ravi Govinda, who is was the leader, of course, now no longer the leader, the Conservative there. And what I found interesting was that he was not blaming Boris Johnson. He was saying it's too early to say what the reason is for why all of this has happened. And he's talked about, you know, for example, the cost of living being something that came up, national issues playing a part. In terms of his own local record, he's still very much of the opinion that the Conservatives there were running things well. They are seen traditionally as the low council tax borough, you know, well managed financially, and so it's national issues rather than local ones that the local Conservatives there are talking about as being the reason for why they've lost this.
Chris, let's talk about, perhaps in the political jargon, about baseline comparison. Lewis mentioned that you have to look at these seats to some extent against when they were last contested in 2018 to see how much progress Labour is making and the Conservatives are either sort of losing or standing still.
Yeah, this is quite a complicated thing to explain, so I'm sorry if I don't do a particularly good job at it. But basically the point is there was a lot of things that changed between the 2018 local elections, when the seats that were fought last night were previously fought, and the 2019 general election when Boris Johnson won that landslide victory. There was a massive realignment that happened in politics with Leave voters and Leave voting areas moving towards the Conservatives and Remain voting areas pretty much sticking with the Labour Party. So what that means is when we see these results tonight, particularly in those red wall areas that moved away from Labour between the 2018 local elections and the 2019 general elections, what we see there is maybe Labour moving slightly backwards in those results last night compared to 2018, but actually that's still a recovery on the results that they achieved in those places in the 2019 general election. Another way of putting it, I think, is probably this. Yes, Labour is doing slightly worse in the red wall than they did in 2018. But in 2018, they won the red wall. It was only in the 2019 general election that they lost it. So actually, last night, Labour probably won the vote, popular vote, across those red wall seats. It would be enough, not necessarily to give the Labour Party a majority in government, probably not even the largest party, but it would almost certainly be enough to put Keir Starmer in Downing Street if the results last night were replicated on a general election.
And of course we have got to get the results from Scotland and Wales, and there's been plenty of talk and indications that Labour could overtake the Conservatives to be the second party in Scotland behind the SNP, although not much evidence that they would take seats or that many seats off the SNP in Scotland where all the councils are being contested. Our political correspondent Nick Eardley is in Barnet for us now. We've just been talking about it. Hello to you, Nick, on what looks like a lovely sunny day. Of course, I can't tell from inside here at the studio. How is it looking there?
It is very sunny, actually, Jo. It's a lovely day. Keir Starmer was here about 40 minutes ago, and this is definitely one of those seats that you're going to hear, or one of these councils, I should say, that you're going to hear Labour shouting about over the next 24 hours, along with the likes of Wandsworth and Westminster. Those parts of London they've struggled to win in the past, but they've won pretty comfortably, actually, overnight. The message from Keir Starmer here, actually, was as much about anti-Semitism as anywhere else. This borough has the highest Jewish population of any local authority in England, and you'll remember when Keir Starmer took over as Labour leader, he made winning back the support of the Jewish population one of his key priorities. But I suppose there is just that bigger question that Keir Starmer will be mulling over as he jumps on a train to his next visit, which is, what does this whole picture tell us about where Labour's support is based now? Because their vote in London is clearly stronger than perhaps it's ever been. You know, maybe some of the old jokes you used to make about Scotland, where you weighed Labour's votes, might become true of large parts of London. But he'll be really keeping an eye on the results over the next few hours in places like the north of England, the Old Red Wall, in Scotland, where Scottish Labour are confident of coming second ahead of the Scottish Tories now, but the extent to which they do that will be really important, and in Wales, because Labour probably need to pick up some seats in Wales if they're going to be on course for a general election victory. So, you know, I don't know if you could hear much of what Keir Starmer was saying there. He was as enthusiastic as I've ever seen him this morning. But there is that wider question and that wider challenge about whether the Tory losses overnight are translating to big Labour gains, and whether the picture might actually be a bit more complicated.
Well, absolutely, Keir Starmer is celebrating what has happened in London. What about the Conservative reaction? Because what I've heard so far is they are pointing, of course, to the broader picture because of those significant losses in London. But these are really totemic councils that have gone, haven't they? That in itself must be worrying Conservative Central Office.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think it'll be worrying Number 10 in particular, because speaking to Tory MPs over the last few weeks when they've been pounding the streets in London, many of them saw this coming. Maybe not Westminster's result, but some of maybe the Wandsworth result, maybe the result here. And they were blaming it on Partygate. They were saying that Boris Johnson just isn't popular on the doorsteps in places like London. Now, they were caveating that by saying if you go to some places in the north of England, that's not so much an issue. It's more the cost of living. But in some of those, if you could use a lazy term like middle class, some of those middle class councils in England, there was a feeling that Boris Johnson was becoming a bit of a liability rather than an asset. Interesting, of course, because he was mayor of London and won over many of those areas about 15 years ago, but maybe has become slightly unpopular there. And one of the questions that will be interesting to watch over the next few hours is whether some of those Tories who are losing their seats, whether more of those Tories who are losing their seats are coming out in saying that. So we've had a few in London saying, look, we think this wasn't down to us, it was down to the bigger picture, it was down to the Prime Minister and the fine he got for breaking COVID laws. The Scottish Tories, I was speaking to a source there last night who was utterly scathing. They think they're going to take an absolute battering over the next few hours north of the border. And they were saying it's solely down to the Prime Minister and to Partygate. Similar picture may well emerge in certain parts of Wales if the Conservatives go backwards. So it's been a bad night for the Tories. It's not been a catastrophic night for the Tories. Don't get the impression from the chats I've had this morning that we're about to see some sort of coup and that Boris Johnson's leadership is under imminent threat, but don't mistake that for a lack of nervousness. There are many in the Conservative Party looking at this result and thinking, hold on, those fines that Boris Johnson and some of his staff got and that Partygate issue is having an electoral impact.
Nick Eardley there, our political correspondent in Barnet. Thank you very much. Well, let's test the temperature with the Conservative MP, Stockton-on-Tees. It is the Tory MP, Matt Vickers. Hello to you, Matt.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. You've lost over 100 council seats overall and you've lost control of 6 councils. What conclusions do you draw from that?
I think, you know what, there are 3 groups of people who will be disappointed this morning. The electors, the residents of Westminster and Wandsworth. In Westminster, they've enjoyed the lowest council tax in the country for years. Wandsworth, the second lowest council tax, they'll be disappointed. The journalists like you, I think, this morning will be struggling to find that headline because actually it wasn't what it was stoked up to be, was it?
Right, well, don't worry about me and the headline we may or may not be struggling to find. You have actually lost council seats overall. You have named, yes, definitely the symbolic London ones that have gone, but you've lost control of Worcester Council and West Oxfordshire and Southampton. You've made losses across England, haven't you? Why is that?
These are, well, let's put it in context. These are midterm elections after 12 years of party government, skewed towards Labour's base in London. It should have been Labour's day. We saw the biggest poll put out by Electoral Calculus and Find Out Now said we were going to lose 800 seats. This should have been Labour's day. They've fallen well short of that.
No one ever really thought it would be as much as 800 seats. That really would have been a complete and utter disaster for the Conservatives. As I say, there is a spread. There is a spread in terms of the losses for Conservatives. I'm just trying to get from you what you think is the problem here. What caused those losses?
I think you've got to look at where we've made success as well. Actually, Labour should be 12 years in government, midterm elections. They should be making massive improvements. But actually, they're still losing ground in Sunderland, in Tyneside, in Hartlepool, in Nuneaton, in Sandwell, in the Amber Valley, everywhere. They're in the north of England. You know what? The Piers brand from the London elite has made some progress in London. But actually, when you look at places like Wandsworth, there was only 141 votes across the entire borough.
Does it not matter? Does it not matter then that you've lost Westminster, Wandsworth and Barnet? Can they just go?
I don't think that's the case at all. I think we've got some very hard-working councillors who've lost a seat, and I'm bitterly disappointed by that. But actually, in real terms, when you look at the national picture, is this a party that's striving towards government and making real progress?
I'll tell you what, let's stick with the Conservative Party because that's the party that you represent. And you say that in the north of England, Labour hasn't made the inroads that they should have done. And that is true to a certain extent. But actually, you have done badly in Cumberland in the northwest. And the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council, the outgoing leader, has come up with a reason for why they have done badly, the Conservatives. He said that Boris Johnson bears a lot of responsibility for these very poor results. He said it's with Partygate and the issue of integrity more widely. Basically, I just don't feel people any longer have the confidence that the Prime Minister can be relied upon to tell the truth. Is he right?
Do you know what? I'll take you back 5 years. No, I'll take you back 3 years.
No, let's just do last night.
Last night, yeah, well, when you put it, you've got to put it in context. You've got to put it in context, and the context is not there for that headline that we've done terribly badly across the country. In Hartlepool, 3 years ago in Hartlepool, we would not have for a moment have assumed that we would have had a Conservative MP there. Last night, despite the fact we're 12 years in government, despite the fact this is a midterm election, we made gains. We gained seats on Hartlepool Council last night.
Right.
This thing is a clear loss for the government.
But can Boris Johnson... Can you tell the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council, can people trust Boris Johnson to tell the truth?
You know what? He's still delivering across the north of England. The people who voted him in, those red wall voters who've been let down by Labour for so long.
What's he delivered on? People's taxes are going up. People's energy bills are going up. There's a cost of living crisis. In what way has Boris Johnson met the real questions from your constituents and voters?
The people in my constituency know what Boris is delivering for them, whether it be that investment in Thornaby Town Centre, whether that be the investment in Yarmouth. Like, there is huge investment in my part of the world, and there are more police on our streets, more doctors and nurses in our hospital, and actually some of those long-term projects in my part of the world, in the Red Wall, where we've been neglected by Labour for so long, we're seeing real investment.
So the Conservative leader of Carlisle City Council is wrong, in your mind, about Boris Johnson and about the losses that have been incurred.
I haven't heard from the leader of.
Well, I've told you what he said.
Yeah, well, I would be very happy to have a discussion with him. But actually, in my part of the world, we've made progress in Hartlepool. In Sunderland, Labour has also fallen back. So from where I sit and where I look out, where we are delivering locally for people, we're getting really good results.
Right. I mean, should Boris Johnson apologise, or would you like to apologise to all those hard-working councillors that you've just talked about who've lost their seats overnight and those councils that have gone?
I am bitterly disappointed for each and every one of them. I'm delighted for the two that we gained in Hartlepool last night, and I'll be out there helping them get across the line and delivering their part of the world. Of course, we're disappointed to lose councils. In fact, I feel sorry for the residents in those councils who have enjoyed fantastically low council tax for years. The lowest council tax in the country.
Well, it wasn't enough, but it wasn't enough. If you were going to suggest one change that the Conservative Party should make following these results and the losses of those councils, what would it be?
I think, do you know what? During the last 2 years, we've had some distractions. We've been able to get our message across. We've been able to talk about all the great things that we're doing in communities like mine. And hopefully, going forward, we're going to be able to get on with that. Because people like you are going to start talking to me about what we're delivering instead of about Partygate and birthday cakes, with a bit of luck, eh?
Well, I haven't mentioned it, actually, so far, but you have. But thank you very much, Matt Vickers, there. Joining me now from Belfast is our correspondent, Dan Johnson. Dan, we're not going to get, I don't think, many results while I'm here in the chair in the studio, but this is extremely important for Northern Ireland, probably the most consequential part of these elections in many ways, because Sinn Féin has been tipped at becoming the largest party in history. How's it looking?
Yeah, it's early days. The voting, the counting has only just begun here in the last hour or so. There are 3 count centres across Northern Ireland, with the results not expected to start coming in until around lunchtime. Then through this afternoon, it'll probably take into the evening, perhaps into the early hours of tomorrow morning, to get a clear picture of exactly where the parties stand and who has come out as the biggest party. The DUP has held that position certainly in the last few years, but the polls have consistently shown in the last few weeks and months that Sinn Féin is leading and is expected to take that position as the biggest party, which would then entitle them to the First Minister position in the Stormont executive. Now, whether in practicality the DUP or the other perhaps biggest unionist party would take up power sharing with Sinn Féin is a major question. The DUP pulled out of power sharing here in February in opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol, the way that the trade rules were hitting trade in Northern Ireland, and they've said they won't go back into power sharing without amendments to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But unionists would also find it difficult to share power with a Sinn Féin First Minister, given Sinn Féin's long stated intent for a united Ireland. So this could be a major step in that direction. But Sinn Féin has been playing that down in this campaign, in this election, saying that this is about local issues, about the cost of living, about energy prices, and that this is not the time to determine Northern Ireland's constitutional position. But certainly there are major issues at play. It's a complicated voting system. Proportional representation is at play, so it takes a bit of time to work out exactly how the seats are shared amongst the different parties. And one thing to look out for is that turnout looks like it will be down on 5 years ago. The estimates last night were that turnout was at around 54-55% an hour before the polls closed. It may be a bit up from that, but it looks like it'll be below the 64-65% of 2017, which may favour the cross-community parties. We may see them doing better in this election, which may be an indication of the old divides being perhaps thrown off by some of the younger electorate here in Northern Ireland as people focus on other issues, aren't determined in their politics by those old issues of whether Northern Ireland is part of the Union or part of a united Ireland. But it is that question that people are looking out for, it potentially taking a step towards, if indeed Sinn Féin do come out on top.
Right, well, Dan, as you say, there's a lot at stake. It's looking busy behind you, despite what you're saying that perhaps turnout may be slightly down. What is the mood? Because you outlined for us very comprehensively the issue of power sharing. Because when I listened and watched the debate with the party leaders in Northern Ireland earlier in the week, Jeffrey Donaldson, the DUP, would not be committed to saying that he would go back into power sharing unless and until the Northern Ireland Protocol that guides the trading arrangements as part of the Brexit Treaty was changed or perhaps got rid of altogether, of which there is no sign of that happening. So what is the mood?
That has been the DUP's fierce opposition, particularly in the last year or so. It's why power sharing became fragile last summer. It's why the DUP is on its third leader in the space of a year. It's why power sharing collapsed in February and why the DUP has said it will not resume power sharing unless there are significant amendments to the way that the Northern Ireland Protocol operates, the way it is hitting, in Unionists' view, business here in Northern Ireland. But then Sinn Féin is supportive of the protocol, says there are economic opportunities here for Northern Ireland because of the status that it now enjoys with those post-Brexit trade rules. So a lot of complicated issues at play. It's going to be fascinating to watch how people fall in terms of their level of support on the core issue of Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom or a united Ireland, how those issues around the protocol and trade in Northern Ireland are going to play out, and whether there is just a general dissatisfaction with the old parties, the old ways of politics here in Northern Ireland, because we've seen government essentially collapse again in the last few months. We've seen inaction on a number of the core issues that many parties say people need to be addressed. The state of the health service here in Northern Ireland is a major priority that lots of people feel isn't getting the attention and the progress that it deserves because of these other political and constitutional questions. And there is a certain level of dissatisfaction with both the major parties. That's why we may see some more support for those cross-community and other parties. It may well be that both the big parties actually lose seats, but the question could be which one loses more.
Dan Johnson there in Belfast for us. Thank you very much. I'm sure we will be returning there throughout the morning. Let's take a pause and time to look at the weather with Matt Taylor. Matt.
Hello. It's been a wet morning across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but that rain is heading its way southwards, so Scotland and Northern Ireland should brighten up as we go through the afternoon to sunny spells. Plenty more in the way of sunny spells across the far south and southeast of England, but elsewhere across England and Wales, cloudier through the afternoon, and to northern England, north and west Wales as we head towards school pick-up evening rush hour, rain starts to arrive. Some of that will be on the heavy side. 22 degrees in the sunshine in the south, 18 in the sunshine further north. Cooler where the rain sets in this afternoon and evening across northern England, north and west Wales. Heavy at times, some of that rain fringing into the Midlands, and it will slide towards East Anglia and South East, but notice not much in the way of rain across some southern counties. Many a garden will still stay dry. Only a few spots of rain through eastern parts of England into tomorrow morning. Most will have a dry night with some clear skies around, a little bit cooler than we've seen through recent nights. But as we start the weekend, whilst one or two showers possible in eastern districts, a cool breeze off the North Sea to north and west, good long sunny spells, and feeling very pleasant in the sunshine too. Bye for now.
Hello, this is BBC News with me, Jo Coburn. The headlines. In local elections in England, the Conservatives suffer a series of significant losses in London, but across the country, Labour are only making modest gains.
We've had some difficult results, and you can see that in London. I would say, though, that we are mid-term, and it's quite a mixed picture because you look elsewhere, whether that's in Hartlepool or Nuneaton or Thurrock, we've actually made gains.
And believe you me, this is a big turning point for us. From the depths of 2019, that general election, back on track.
Elsewhere, the Liberal Democrats and Greens are making gains. In Hull, the Liberal Democrats won control of the council from Labour. Counting is getting underway for the local elections in Scotland and Wales, and also in Northern Ireland, where voters have been having their say over forming a new government. And in other news, the UN says a new convoy is heading to the Ukrainian city of Mariupol in an attempt to rescue scores of civilians trapped underground with little food or water. Welcome to our continuing coverage of the election results across the UK. So far, it's been a mixed picture for all the parties. In England, the Conservatives have lost control of 3 symbolic London councils, Westminster, Barnet and Wandsworth, to Labour. The Liberal Democrats and Greens have also made gains across England. Counting has only just begun in council elections across Scotland and Wales, and in Northern Ireland, where voters have been electing members of the Stormont Assembly. So here's the state of play for the parties. Let's take a look here. You can see 75 of 146 councils declared, as we've just been discussing. Labour have taken those 3 totemic London councils from the Conservatives, so plus 3, they're on 37. They've lost one to the Liberal Democrats, who you can see have gained. Overall, Conservatives have lost 6 councils and are on 18. And hung councils, the number of those in no overall control, have gone up 2 to 16. Let's just show you, because we were talking earlier with Chris Curtis about the baseline of 2018. You can see here England changed since 2018 of key wards, 470 of the 738 declared. Just as Chris was saying, there's a sort of a slight drop overall for Labour, 0.4%, a bigger drop for the Conservatives of minus 4%. Liberal Democrats have added 1 percentage point. As you can see there, the Greens are plus 1. UKIP have gone down to 2%, losing councillors. Chris, you really gave us that sort of summary earlier on. In terms of what the Labour Party would have to do now to try and build that support, Conservative MP just earlier in a former Red Wall seat, saying they're still not doing well enough in those Red Wall areas.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Labour's still got a big task to do, and I don't think anybody you spoke to in the Labour Party would disagree with that. I mean, if you look at opinion polls at the moment, the majority of voters who we speak to say that they don't think Labour is ready for government. A majority of voters that we speak to don't think Keir Starmer is currently a Prime Minister in waiting. We've seen, whatever question you ask, whether it's trust on the economy, who would make the best Prime Minister, who you trust on crime, we see the people who say something, pick the Conservatives or the Conservative option in those questions go down quite dramatically, but only modest rises for the Labour Party, which is basically what we've seen again in these election results tonight. So I think what the Labour Party needs to do is not just sweep up a little bit because the Conservative people are disillusioned with the Conservatives, but also actually make people want to positively vote for the Labour Party and what the Labour Party has to offer. That's the task that they've got in front of them over the next couple of years.
Now, who former Conservative voters are blaming? Boris Johnson, the issue of parties, cost of living is clearly the biggest issue of all, and people's taxes have just gone up and energy bills are continuing to rise. Aren't these the sorts of things that will really make Conservatives think, is Boris Johnson still a winner?
I mean, look, the cost of living crisis is the biggest issue that voters tell us, top of their mind at the moment, top of the mind when they were voting yesterday. The cost of living cannot be understated as an issue when it comes to voters at the moment, and I think when it comes to the sort of setup and the run-up to the next general election. I think the difficulty for the Conservatives is I'm not really sure what the plan is. When we've seen the Conservatives fall behind in the past, so in the 2010 to 2015 Parliament, we understood what the plan is, right? We came here on mornings like this, we said disappointing results for the Conservatives, but it's mid-term, the Conservatives have got an economic plan that they're hoping will turn things around before the next general election. When the Conservatives fell behind in that sort of 2017 to 2019 Parliament, they replaced their leader and they changed their strategy in order to get it back. At this stage, I can't really see what the Conservative plan is to turn this around. So when we're seeing opinion polls showing Labour ahead in the polls, and again, that's roughly what we saw last night as well, when you expected to see a cost of living crisis, people in this country getting a lot poorer, the economy, the figures out yesterday were pretty bad. What I don't really understand is, in that situation, what's the Conservative strategy in order to go from being behind in the polls at the moment to a situation where they're enough ahead in the polls at the next general election in order to get a majority government? I don't know what the answer to that question is right now, and I'm not sure the Conservative Party does either. Well,
we'll be putting some of those points to Conservatives as we go through the programme this morning. But let's get the latest for now from West Yorkshire, where our correspondent Aisha Iqbal is in Wakefield. Hello to you, Aisha.
Good morning, Jo from Wakefield. Yes, the verification of votes here in Wakefield has just started for local elections. A third of the total 63 seats are being fought for here. Now, this is a Labour-controlled council. It's got a significant majority of 23. It's insurmountable today. And if we look at the wider picture for West Yorkshire, we've got 5 Labour-held councils here. The story in terms of those individual component areas, which includes Leeds, Calderdale, Bradford and Kirklees, is a little bit different in each. Potentially we could have a story developing in Leeds where there's a Labour majority of 7, and as early as 2010 there was a Lib Dem and Conservative coalition there. So things could change there. Kirklees is a bit of a tight edge one for Labour. They're a minority control there, so that could be interesting. They would need 4 votes there to have a majority. Here in Wakefield, as I say, it's insurmountable, the actual Labour majority that they have. 21 seats, as I say, being contested. 15 of those are currently held by Labour, 5 by the Tories. So potentially the Tories could be wiped out with those 5 seats today, and that could cause a serious dent for them in terms of the wider picture. Now, in some ways, Jo, what's going to happen after the count is finished here is going to be the real story here. We're going to be finishing around 5:30, the final declaration of the results. Wakefield is a seat that was a parliamentary seat that was Labour held for 87 years, a real heartland. There's a by-election looming though, Jo. So pretty much before the ink has dried on the paperwork here, the campaigners are going to be out again on the by-election trail. Imran Ahmed Khan, the former sitting MP, has resigned after his conviction for a historic sexual assault. So campaigning is going to start very soon. And speculation really around who could be brought in as a candidate there. We know for Labour that Ed Balls, former Labour heavyweight, who used to be the MP for Morley and Atwood just down the road here, has ruled himself out. Some names being suggested to me, grassroots kind of Conservative names in the local associations who could put their names in the mix. Really, we're waiting for confirmation on that. However, in terms of the issues on the ground, in terms of what people on the doorstep are telling the campaigners, the cost of living crisis, we keep hearing it again and again, that's the key thing. But also, when in 2019 the parliamentary seat was snatched by the Tories from Labour, it was the trust in Boris, it was the Brexit bounce, as we call it, that was the winning factor. That seems to have dissipated a little bit. The trust seems to have been dissipated. And in many ways, this is seen as a litmus test, this local election, a bit of a referendum on the trust that people have on the national leaders, on Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer, and neither coming away really with glory from the doorstep here. So that trust needs to be brought back. One thing to mention, Jo, there was another by-election here in Wakefield, in West Yorkshire just last year, the Batley and Spen by-election. Kim Ledbeater, the sister of Jo Cox, won that by just 322 votes. The Conservatives came very close to snatching that very traditional Labour seat. Could that story play out again here? There is a lot of trust to be rebuilt with the communities. It's about levelling up, it's about regeneration, it's about investing in local transport. These are the things that local people here want to see, but ultimately it is about that trust in the main leadership.
Aisha Iqbal, thank you very much there in Wakefield in West Yorkshire. And as Aisha has been saying, of course, all eyes will soon turn on that upcoming by-election, which Labour will be very much hoping to take back from the Conservatives. Let's get a little more detailed analysis of the results so far. We can cross the newsroom to Lewis Goodall at the touch screen. Lewis, any update?
Well, Joe, we haven't had any more counts in yet, but as you say, counting is resuming in lots of places in England, getting underway in Scotland and Wales. But in terms of the results we have had, I thought it might be instructive to have a look at, and in some ways I don't like this phrase, but it's a bit imprecise, it's a bit inexact, but the so-called red wall. It's what everyone's been talking about pretty much in politics since 2019. Before we do, and as a point of comparison, let's just take a look, given that Keir Starmer has been there this morning and chosen to go there. Let's just look at Barnet. Now, I think this is an important victory for Labour. All of the results, as we've been talking about in London, are important. It's an important symbolic victory, though, as well, because actually Labour, there was some suggestion back in 2018 that Labour might win this. They didn't. One of the reasons they almost certainly didn't is because of the anti-Semitism crisis that was taking place in the Labour Party at that time. Barnet, a very Jewish area of London, the most Jewish borough in the country, I think, and you meant that Labour didn't take the seat. But this time, they've romped home. 12 gains against 12 losses. Also important because of the parliamentary seats which are in Barnet. 3 potentially marginal seats, each a bit more or less marginal than the other. There is Chipping Barnet, Theresa Villiers' seat, majority of about 1,000. There's Hendon, classic swing marginal seat. Mike Freer's seat, about 3,000 or 4,000 majority, I think. That, again, if Labour is going to really be looking for a majority sort of seat it needs. On outside chance, there is also Finchley and Golders Green, again, a very Jewish seat. If Labour were to match this sort of recovery, maybe that seat could be in play. As I say, it would be a very symbolic one, given where the Labour Party has been over the last few years. But of course, then you leave London and it gets a bit more hazy. So you go to somewhere like, there have been other reasonable good news stories for Labour. You go to somewhere like Chorley. Of course, this is the Speaker's seat, Lindsay Hoyle's seat, so as long as he's there, Labour can't really compete for it. But nonetheless, this is a classic Conservative Labour marginal when it's not the Speaker's seat. And you can see there, Labour up 3, Conservatives down 3. You might consider that to be the so-called red wall. If Speaker Hoyle had been a Labour MP at the last election, he may well have lost it in the 2019 almost landslide. Dudley, again, somewhere where the Labour Party, until recently, well, relatively recently, had both seats, but certainly until 2019, had 1 seat, Dudley North, Ian Austin's old seat. Well, I mean, again, the Conservatives now have a majority there of about 11,500. Can Labour retake it? Well, they'll probably need to be doing a little bit better than just taking 2 seats back, but it is some modest progress, again, but is modest good enough? And then in some places, of course, we are seeing them go backwards. So somewhere like Oldham, a really interesting place and interesting politics of late. Last year, when these seats were up, their leader in Oldham lost their seat, the Labour leader in 2021, and again overnight in 2022, his successor has lost her seat as well, because Oldham have been going down by 5, mainly actually to independent groups. And this is a feature that you're increasingly seeing across English local politics, particularly in Labour, northern areas, in places like Greater Manchester. You're seeing the rise of these independent groups eating away, Labour still have the majority here, but eating away at their majority over time. And then if we have a look at somewhere like Cumberland, well, we've talked about that just before, again, important in parliamentary terms because of the parliamentary seats there, but that's about as far as it gets. As I say, it's difficult to really chart a course, but we will have more information coming over the course of the morning and the afternoon. And 2, just to keep your eye on, Joe, Wakefield you've already talked about, important because of the glimmer, the tantalising glimmer it might give us for the upcoming by-election, which I would suggest is a must-win for Keir Starmer's leadership. And this is a really interesting one. Newcastle-under-Lyme in Staffordshire. It's a seat, it's one of the only so-called red wall boroughs where all of the seats are up for election. As you'll have seen in so many of these places, it's just a third, which makes it hard to get really good and accurate extrapolation. But all of the seats are up in Newcastle-under-Lyme. The Conservatives took it last time. It had at a parliamentary level been a Labour seat since 1919. The Conservatives also took that. Aaron Bell, the 2019 general election. That really will be, with all of those clutch of seats in Staffordshire, the Stoke-on-Trent seats and so on, that the Conservatives really astonishingly took at the last election. There will be a lot of Conservative MPs in that part of the West Midlands keeping a very close eye on that result. So one to watch out for over the course of the afternoon, Joe.
Lewis, before I let you go, as you say, we're getting results in all the time. I mean, there is this issue, of course, that the baseline, as you said earlier, is 2018 when these seats were last contested in England, and also that in most cases outside London, it's a third of the seats that are actually being contested and won and lost.
Yeah, and it does make it difficult. Look, these seats were always going to be difficult necessarily to get really good extrapolations or analyses from. Why? Well, they're so London-centric. The majority of the seats in England being contested are in London. We know that the Labour Party does very well in London, that London has been trending towards the Labour Party over time. We've seen that again and again over the course of the last 24 hours. Outside of London, it's a real patchwork of the sort of places that are up. As you say, some are in thirds, some aren't. But as I say, this is the sort of, if we're looking for a trend, what we can say is that the Labour Party, I think I can actually show you here to give you a bit more of a sort of global view of it. If you're looking for a trend, what you can say, again, Labour Party doing better than they did in 2018 in London. They already did pretty well in 2018 in London under Jeremy Corbyn, but doing better still. The Conservatives doing really, really badly. They are in danger of becoming something of an endangered species in London. They only had 7 councils going into these elections. They'll have far fewer than that coming out of it. Their only council in inner London will be Kensington and Chelsea. Now they've lost Westminster and they lost Wandsworth as well. But in the north of England, it's a different story. Labour Party actually going backwards on Jeremy Corbyn's performance in 2018, the Conservative going backwards as well. And actually the main beneficiaries in the north of England, Lib Dems have actually done all right better in other parts of the country. We can perhaps talk about that a bit later, particularly in the south of England. But the Greens doing well, and the Independents doing as well. So you can see it is a mixed picture. We keep using that phrase, but it is a good way of describing the results that we've had so far. And I think the truth is there's something in it for everyone in these results. There's something for the Labour Party. They can say we're doing better than we did in 2019, doing better than we did in 2021. The Conservatives can say, well, we're not doing as badly as you might expect we might, given the circumstances, given the fact that we're 12 years in. And so in that sense, both parties will have something to comfort themselves with and something to worry about as well.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that analysis, Lewis Goodall there. Chris, let's just pick up on Scotland. We haven't got results coming in at the moment. Counting is starting. Of course, it is a proportional system there too, so it probably will take a little bit more time. 16 and 17-year-olds are able to vote. But the important indicator from polling has been that Labour could leapfrog the Conservatives, who performed very well last time in 2017 when all the councils were contested, and they may leapfrog them to second place. But how much impact will they make or could they make against the SNP?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it would now be a surprise if the Labour Party don't end up in second place this evening. Today, when the results are counted from the votes that were I haven't slept. I don't know what time it is.
We'll get you some coffee.
We're expecting the Labour Party to come in second place in Scotland. It would be a surprise if they don't. The Conservatives, I think it's fair to say, have run a pretty difficult local election campaign in Scotland. For one thing, they didn't know whether they backed the Conservative Prime Minister or not.
Well, no, Douglas Rodd, their leader, did literally an about turn, didn't he?
Changed stance halfway through. And look, Labour has gone back into second place in the polls in Scotland for the first time in about half a decade. That's quite significant, and I think it's going to be a really important dynamic as we head into the next general election, that actually a lot of these battles that were freeway battles before are now a lot more likely to be Labour and SNP battles. And this is significant, and this is really significant because there's a general consensus that Labour can't win a general election or a majority in a general election without some level of fight back in Scotland. Now, what we might be seeing today, potentially, is the first signs of a Labour fight back in Scotland. Maybe it's still very, very far away from that period when they dominated Scotland and won all the seats there. But it might just be those early signs that actually they're getting into second place and starting to take some votes back off the SNP while sweeping up the Unionist vote and making it clear that they're the main Unionist party, so taking down the Conservatives as well.
And of course, the big constitutional question is still the issue of a second independence referendum. The SNP say they have a mandate. They will continue to have a mandate probably after these election results. And Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, has clearly set out that she wants to see and hold that referendum, certainly by the end of next year, 2023. But no sign of the government, who have to give permission in this sense for it to happen.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I think what Labour's going to try and do in this argument in Scotland is they're going to have the Conservatives going, we don't want a referendum. They're going to have the SNP going, we want a referendum. That's the most important issue to us. Labour's hoping they can come in through the middle and say, you can argue about a referendum as much as you like. Here's our solution to the cost of living crisis. And I think that's Labour's plan for Scotland. Now, there might be some signs in the local elections today, the local election results today, that that's working. But I think it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. And as I say, I think that we might be starting to see some very early signs of a Labour fight back in Scotland.
Chris Curtis from Opinion, thank you very much for keeping me company this past hour. Now, in other news, in Ukraine, more buses are on the way to Mariupol as part of a plan to rescue some of the hundreds of civilians trapped in the maze-like tunnels under the Azovstal steelworks. The operation is being run jointly by the United Nations and the Red Cross. The UN Secretary-General says everything must be done to get people out of what he called hellscapes. Russia has been bombing other cities in the region as it tries to secure more territory in the east of the country. Vincent McAvaney reports.
For decades, the Soviet-era Azovstal steelworks has provided work for the people of Mariupol in East Ukraine. But for the past few weeks, this sprawling 4-square-mile complex has instead provided them relative shelter. Food has been running out, clean water is scarce. Thousands are thought to have tried hiding underground here from surrounding Russian forces, but the scale of the bombardment is clear. Yesterday, though, Russia had pledged a ceasefire to allow surviving Ukrainians to escape. But Ukraine officials who released these images say that hasn't happened. President Putin declaring instead the last fighters holding out at the steelworks should surrender. President Zelensky welcomes $6.5 billion in reconstruction funds, pledged at an international aid conference in Poland yesterday. But speaking last night, his disappointment at the Kremlin's continued aggression was clear.
Currently, Russian shelling and assault of Azovstal do not stop, but civilians still need to be taken out. Women, children, many children who are still there. Just imagine, this is hell, and there are children there. More than 2 months of constant shelling, bombing, constant death nearby.
In Moscow, Putin's soldiers are rehearsing for the annual 9th of May World War II victory celebrations. Capturing at least Mariupol would provide a much-needed boost for a president who wrongly believed he'd have taken the whole country months ago. The UN and Red Cross will today attempt to evacuate civilians trapped here. There may be money on the way to rebuild Ukraine's infrastructure, but for those who managed to escape Mariupol, rebuilding their lives after the trauma of what's happened here won't be as easy. Vincent McAvaney, BBC News.
Now it's time for a look at the weather with Matt Taylor. Matt.
Hello. Whilst many a garden in southern parts of England will stay dry yet again, there's certainly been a bit more rain around today. That rain heading its way southwards. It does mean it's now going to be brighter for the afternoon across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland as this weather front starts to push its way across other parts of England and Wales. But notice how it's running into an area of high pressure in the south. It will fade as you go into the evening as it reaches those gardens where you desperately need the rain at the moment. So here's where we stand into the beginning of the part of the afternoon. Still raining to the southeast of Northern Ireland, but that rain getting heavier across Northern England, North and West Wales, brightening up through Scotland, Northern Ireland, isolated showers, but feeling warm in the sunny spells, especially to the east of high ground, 18 there in Aberdeenshire. Whilst we'll see more cloud through the Midlands, East Anglia, southern parts of England, still some sunny spells here, highs of 21 or 22. But rain for the afternoon, early evening, parts of Northern England, Wales, spreading through the Midlands. There will be a few splashes of rain across some southern counties, but not much. Some gardens will stay completely dry, and most will be dry into tomorrow morning. Clearest of skies north and west, feeling a little bit cooler than it did this morning. So into the weekend we go. Saturday, there'll be cloud at times, especially in eastern areas, producing the odd isolated shower. Many western, northern parts, it's going to be a dry and bright day, certainly a much sunnier day for parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, northwest England and northwest Wales. And even though the air mass is a little bit cooler, temperatures down a touch on today's values, you'll probably notice that mostly across those eastern coastal counties, it'll actually feel very pleasant in that strong sunshine. High pressure is certainly in charge as we finish Saturday. It holds on into Sunday. As it slips a little bit further eastwards, though, we do allow weather fronts just to graze in to the north and west, and that will introduce a little bit more cloud at times. Sunshine a bit on the hazy side across northern and western areas, and parts of western Scotland, maybe even Northern Ireland, could catch the odd spot of rain. Much of England, Wales and a good part of Scotland will stay dry, starting to feel a bit warmer again away from some of these eastern coasts, and warmer still for some across England, Wales into Monday. More of a southerly airflow here, sunny spells for the most part, greater chance of rain though for Scotland and Northern Ireland once again, but temperatures climbing more widely into the 20s where you've got the sunshine, and that warmer air will be with us for much of next week. Still very little rain across some southern areas, but but to parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, there'll be further rain at times. Bye for now.
As Russian troops retreat from parts of Ukraine, the shocking impact of the invasion is being revealed.
Only a ballistic missile can do this sort of damage.
The damage here gives a sense of how fierce the fighting has been.
These people have been escaping from cities that have been under Russian bombardment.
See the headlines as they happen on the BBC News app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the latest on the Russian invasion of Ukraine with BBC News.
This is BBC News. I'm Jo